along today. It's my pleasure to introduce today Gerry Nyman, and a lot of people here will probably know Gerry's been involved with ESAIS over many years, and he's been lead author on a number of publications, and it's a real pleasure having him here today. Not only is he going to be presenting, but he's also going to be actually documenting today's event and the different talks that we're going to be listening to today. So that's really fantastic. His presentation today is really about, is concerning the important steps institutions need to take to put in place, in fact, in their IT, to ensure that IT are not left holding the security baby. So without any more delay, I'll hand over to Gerry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks, Graham, for giving me something to live up to. Not building on sand. So the organiser said to me, right, Gerry, keep it light, keep it practical based on your experience and things that people can go back and apply immediately when they get back to base. So I thought, great, I know what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why the clicker doesn't work. Oh dear, what am I doing? Maybe I've got the right. Let's try this one. I know what I'll talk about. I'll talk about policy. Oh, why policy? Well, because as we all know, it's the most fascinating, it's the most immediately useful aspect of cybersecurity, isn't it? Okay, right. We all know it can be a very dry subject. It can feel detached. It can be really quite boring, and it can take forever to get anything done. Sometimes it takes years for anything to happen, and it always seems to lag behind the threat landscape, it lags behind the technology, it lags behind the way the university is organised, although it never seems to lag quite behind legislation for some reason. But I'm going to, or from my experience, it's absolutely vital that you have this right, because if you don't, you're just building on sand. Now, what I've found is that if you don't have sensible, well thought through and institutionally backed policies, then the cybersecurity professionals out here find themselves in the middle of a perfect storm of conflicting interests and conflicting views. And from personal experience, I can say it's quite a lonely place to be sometimes. So get the policies and all the foundations right. And specifically what I'm going to be talking about, information security awareness training, privacy impact assessments, and four of the most relevant policies for today's conference, which are information classification, systems admin policy, monitoring policy, and incident management policy. I can tell you can hardly wait. So, first of all, information security awareness training. So what's the weakest link in any information security arrangements? Altogether now, people. It's the people. And the easiest thing to do about the people threats, as Graham has been pointing out, give them some awareness training. This falls into the category of the bleeding obvious, doesn't it? Now, James is going to be talking a bit more about this later on, so I'm going to be very, very brief. But one thing to point out, ESAIS has arranged for you the Leo Learning product. It's pretty good. It's not the last word in information security awareness training. It's not bad. It can be done in a coffee break. It gives you a pass or fail at the end of it, and it's free. So, show of hands, who is using this as... Yeah, no. Oh, not bad, not bad. Great. Good start. Another show of hands. How many people have got mandatory information security awareness training? Oh, that's not bad. It's better than I thought it might be. A lot of places seem to have a problem with this. Why wouldn't it be mandatory? You've got mandatory training for health and safety. You've got mandatory training for equalities. You may even have mandatory training for sustainability. I don't know. Is cybersecurity any less important than those? Think about it. Who is the person in your organisation or the group of people most likely to respond to a phishing email or social engineering? You know the usual suspects, don't you? And then think about who is it who's least likely to say they need to go on the training. Now, Venn diagram time, do those people overlap? Yeah? I like to apply the John Humphreys test. You've had a security breach. So, your VC has been interviewed. So, tell me, Vice-Chancellor, it's easy to be wise after the event, but surely, given that you've arranged information security awareness training, you should have insisted that everybody went on it. how do you answer something like that? So, top tip number one, if you possibly can, try and persuade your institution to get this training mandatory. Privacy impact assessments. Now, Robbie Walker's going to be talking later on about risk assessments in general. This is just one part of risk assessment, but I happen to think it's a very useful part. And it's the Information Commissioner's Office's best kept secret. It's something I didn't know about till I really started digging into something, and then, hey, this fantastic, really easy thing to apply. It simply says for any new project, you take a structured approach to look at the privacy risks that introduces, identify solutions, and make sure those solutions are built into the project. Easy. Privacy risks overlap very much with security risks. Great. And I think they're your best friend. They're really, really good for fleshing out the guerrilla RT, the shadow RT that Graham was talking about. I can think of many, many occasions where really quite horrendous things have been done by departments out in the areas for the best possible reasons, but they've not thought through the privacy aspects of it. Now, if this becomes something that your university does as standard practice, you would get to know about it. I'm sure you can also think of similar examples. Now, at the moment, privacy impact assessments are recommended practice. If you're a government unit, especially in the Cabinet Office, you have to do them. But for everybody else, it's just recommended practice. But that's all going to change. When GDPR comes along, Craig's going to be talking about that later, they'll become mandatory, or something very similar to a PIA will become mandatory for some type of processing. So, top tip number 2, before that happens, get your institution to introduce them now. Get used to doing them. They're not difficult, they are really, really useful. And the best part is that UCISA is working on some guidance on this. It should be available hopefully in a few weeks' time. Consultation on that is currently open. If you're interested in contributing, please contact myself or Anna Matthews, who's around, and we'll get your views known. And this guidance will use Office 365 as a worked example, so it should really be quite useful. So that's PIAs. So on to the policies themselves, and before going through the 4 policies, a word about making policies a bit more dynamic. Now, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I remember sitting in a meeting that was chaired by the finance director, and we were talking about whether it was appropriate to open port 23 on the firewall. And this conversation went on for about half an hour. And I remember waking up during the middle of it and thinking, I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life. Surely there is some way to be a bit fleet of foot. Now, in my experience, by the time that a threat has been identified and the IT director has said, oh, we need a policy, and the cyber guy has written a policy, and it's been approved within IT, then it's gone to the policy committee and they've thought about it, and then it goes to the university exec, and then it goes from the university exec to the board of governors and it gets approved. What are we talking about? 6 months? 9 months? A year? How much has the threat landscape changed in that time? It's not good enough. So, you can't change your governance structures, but this is something you can do. Yes, you have your high-level information security policy, and this sets out the aims and objectives. It sets out the governance, it sets out the responsibilities, but doesn't go into too much detail about anything. And then below that, you have a number of specific policies. This might be network security, it might be server security, BYOD policy, user training. I would imagine that about a dozen specific policies would cover everything you need. And these policies, these are formal, they're stable but reviewed on a regular basis, at least every 12 months each, and they set out the high level and the specific aims and objectives in that area, and they're formally approved by the 6-month, 9-month, 12-month route, whatever it takes. But they don't go into too much detail about how you're going to counter that threats covered by the policy. Instead, what you have is below each of the, well, not necessarily all, but a lot of the policies, technical standards. The technical standards, they're dynamic. You update them whenever you need to update them. They're maintained by the people who understand the threats and understand the countermeasures that work. And they do not need formal approval. They're subject to suitable scrutiny. They work within the constraints set by the policy, but the point is you can change them at a day's notice as you need to. And in order for that to be managed, yeah, the policies themselves need to set out the boundaries. What do these technical standards need to achieve? And who maintains the technical standards? How are they going to be scrutinised? And in my experience, if you take that sort of approach, you can get the high-level approval, it gives you the institutional backing, but at the lower level, you can move very, very quickly. So, on to some of the policies themselves. Information classification policy, as Graham said, cybersecurity is a balance between accessibility and security. And the one-size-fits-all solution just isn't going to work. So this is about how do you guard the crown jewels but still let visitors around the tower. And it's about setting security classifications for different types of information. So it's going to have to be done in close collaboration with your information governance people. And typically you might have, I don't know, 3, 4 levels. So you might have unrestricted information, confidential information, top secret. You'll have different names. You might have 4 levels. Some places have 5. It doesn't really matter as long as you've thought it through. And the policy will set out how do you record the classification. Oh, it's easy on paper. You stamp it, top secret. On digital information, not quite so obvious, but the point is people accessing that information have to know what level they're looking at. But the whole point of it is it sets out the level of protection that's appropriate for each classification. So unrestricted, do what you like with it. Top secret, it must be encrypted at rest. You can't send it as email unencrypted. You can't store it on your own devices. These are the sort of things that you would have in a technical standard below the policy to say, right, well, this is how we maintain accessibility for this stuff, security for that stuff. Now, this is really useful because there's a lot of information protection frameworks out there that are very powerful as long as you've got something like this. I wouldn't say familiar, but I'm aware of things like data loss prevention in Office 365 and Azure Access Rights Management. And they can do wonderful, wonderful things, but it's up to the institution to say, this needs top-level protection, this is fine. If you don't address this, get this right in the first place, then you're trying to apply information security measures that are the same for everything, and you're going to get attacked from both sides. In some circumstances, people are going to say, this is far too restrictive. In other circumstances, people are going to say, you're not really secure enough. You have to have a range. Get the institution behind you. Systems admin policy. This is about the institutional backing for you guys to do your day-to-day job. You may be familiar with the the System Admin's Charter. This was written by Andrew Cormack quite a long time ago. It's really good. It tells you the sort of standards you should adhere to, the sort of code of practice. In itself, it's not quite enough that you need policies surrounding that, and the policies might talk about things like having approved competent people, records kept. I came across a case not that very long ago where a placement student had root-level access to a finance system. And they had root-level access because they'd helped to write it and implement it. And you're thinking, well, really, what do we know about this placement student? Because they've now got really privileged access. And that was bad enough, that was worrying enough as it was. But the bit that really made my hairs stand up was the fact that 18 months after the placement had finished, the student still had root-level access to that finance system. Now, this is not something that Central IT had endorsed. This had happened somewhere else. And it makes you wonder, what did they have in place? Did they think about this sort of thing? Do you have levels of competence defined for your system admins? And I'm not just talking about people in IT who look after the network and the infrastructure servers, people with elevated privileges in your HR systems, in your finance systems, your student record systems, supervisory rights. Do you keep records? Would you know who had access to which systems 14 months ago? Because not all incidents come to light immediately. Sometimes you find that something was planted way back when, and it's only just come to light now. Who had access at that point? Do you have those records? This is fairly easy stuff to implement, but not many places do. And then there's the bread and butter stuff. You all know stuff like this. Don't have shared accounts, and don't have privileges that are always switched on. You log into your account when you need the privileges, you elevate. do what you need to do, come back down again. I'm sure you know all about that stuff. But without this sort of policy, you're out there on your own in some respects. Similarly, monitoring policy, again, this is about giving you the institutional backing to do the stuff that you need to do on a day-to-day basis. And it sets out, the policy should set out a regulatory and policy framework, and this is really complicated. The legislation that you have to comply with, on the one hand you have data protection, which is talking about keeping stuff private and not over-intruding in people's lives. On the other hand, you have things like the Terrorism Act, which is saying, no, you've got to monitor this for your prevent duty. And then off to the side, you've got people's expectation of privacy, and then you've got the whole question of academic freedom. Trying to navigate your way through that is something that the cyber security professionals should not be left alone to manage themselves. The institution should be thinking this through really very carefully, setting out and saying, right, this is how we're going to do it. Give people some backing. Why are you doing the monitoring? 2 clues here. You don't do it for fun, and you don't do it because you're curious to know what the person down the corridor is doing. The reasons you do monitoring usually fall into 3 categories. 1, to comply with legislation. 2, to enforce university policies. And 3, to make sure your systems are working effectively. There might be a 4th one. Your institution might say, we like to do research on networks, and therefore, as we're doing research on networks, gathering information about how the networks are being used is valuable information. So that would be a 4th reason. But whatever it is, if people have this aversion to being monitored, then setting out the reasons is quite important. Policy issues to that. Who can do it? Not everybody should be allowed to do it. Would you allow any interested undergraduate to plug something into the network and see what's going on? Who's allowed to see the results? This is all very, very basic stuff, but doing it without the policy behind you leaves you very exposed. Where's the monitoring list? Do you know what monitoring your institution does? Again, apply the John Humphreys test. This time you've hit the news because people object to the fact that you're monitoring visits to websites. And say, well, you know, what actually are you monitoring? I'm not quite sure. Make sure that you've got that all set out clearly. The stuff that you're doing every day, all the time, it should be pretty well documented. What you're doing, how long it's, what information is being gathered, where is it stored, all that sort of thing. But there's also monitoring that you're going to have to do exceptionally. You've got intelligence that says there's a particular threat in a particular area. Please, can you keep an eye on that? The policy is to say, right, how is that authorised? Is it okay to do it on the strength of a phone call from somebody, or is there something a bit more formal that needs to be in place to give you the backing? Because if you haven't got the backing to do it, you could be in breach of all sorts of stuff. And then whatever you're doing, retention periods, how long are you keeping the information? You've got data protection pulling you in one direction, you've got other legislation pulling in another direction. Make sure you get that bit right. Incident management, Dave Dayton's talking about this at length later, so again, keeping it brief. It's important everybody knows how to recognise an event. The events are not always as obvious as you might think. They don't always look like that. Sometimes it's a stranger hanging around in the lobby. Sometimes it's an unexpected email. People need to understand what that is. But they also need to report it, how to report something. I've lost my PC. Who do I tell? Do I tell security? Do I tell the IT department? Do I tell the data? Make sure everybody knows. Obviously, you've got to counter the immediate threat, but also think about preserving the evidence for future investigation. And how do you escalate it? When do you tell the CIO? When do you tell the data protection officer? When do you tell the system owners? Do you need to inform anybody else? Janet CSIRT? What about the Information Commissioner's Office? All this needs to be thought through in advance. It's really better not to be trying to make this up on the fly. And one of the key stakeholders could well be the press office, external relations, because one of the biggest outcomes of an incident could well be damage to the university's reputation. They need to know about this from the start so they can manage that immediately. And root cause analysis. What was really the root cause of this? Was it a lack of a proper email filter? Was it the lack of understanding of that particular user who's always been a bit flaky? Or was it the fact that you're not training people properly? And statistical information, what's the trends? How are things changing? Are we getting more incidents of ransomware or what? So you know what to deal with. Okay, well, in conclusion then, I've mentioned a few other names. There's a lot of useful information coming later on. But try and keep your policies dynamic. Try and keep them up to date with the threat as it stands right now as opposed to 9 months ago. Make sure you've got a sound policy basis for the things you need to do, both on a regular basis and on an exceptional basis. In other words, don't build on sand. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Sherry. I think we have a couple of mics here. Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes, folks. And it may well be that we have maybe some questions on the privacy impact assessment. I know you've been heavily involved with that.
Yeah.
And Anna Matthews is around somewhere. I don't know if she's in. There she is, right there. So if anybody has particular discussion they'd like to have on that, Anna and Jerry are around, and I'd encourage you to do so. But anyway, do we have any questions? We've got a mic here, and we'll run around the room as quickly as possible before we have our break. We've got one here from Ted.
Hi, Jerry. Ted, thanks for that. Privacy impact assessments. We did our first one with Microsoft Office 365, and we actually looked around and stole as much from other people's work as we could, filled out our own, and then, but I find now when I ask non-IT departments to fill out the privacy impact assessment, it's the most simple template, and as you say, it's really worthwhile, privacy by design.
Yeah.
But they're really struggling with it. They really don't. I can't understand why they can't understand it. Are you finding that at all?
The approach that I take to doing privacy impact assessment is to, rather than say, here's a form, fill it in, is to work with them because, as the RCO would stress, it's the process that really matters. The document you get at the end of it is, yeah, it's useful. What really matters is the process that you go through and the fact that you identify solutions and build them in. So if you, I found that the process is far more effective if it's a dialogue between people who've done it before, can explain what is meant by this question, and it lead them through and say, well, you know, things like, yeah, I know you deal with lots of sensitive information, but do you send it by email? How do you store it? That sort of thing. Rather than, here's a questionnaire, fill it in. But people, yeah, I can see that people would struggle with that.
Well, thanks very much. I'll be implementing that.
Any further questions? We've got one in front here.
David.
One for our earlier speaker, David Hailing from the University of Kent. In some ways, you've left us terrified, which is part of the reason giving us all those examples. As Bruce Steyer says, we've spent decades teaching our users to click on links. So now we're turning around and saying, don't click on some of them. Yeah. How should we deal with that contradiction?
Well, I've got a microphone on, actually. I don't know if I'm still on or not. Maybe not. I mean, there's a number of things here. Obviously, we can put technology in place in order to look at the veracity of a link. You know, so we should be doing web filtering, just as we're doing email filtering, looking at the content which is on the web page which you'll go into. But I think training, really, it's about unexpected emails. It's about unsolicited emails, emails which are outside of the normal communication. If you get an email which says, kindly check the attached love letter coming from me, from one of your friends, it's like, well, whoever says kindly check, you know, it's looking for that unusual behavior and getting people to be a bit suspicious. I think the biggest danger comes from those people who actually use computers sparingly, rather than ones who are using it regularly and are used to how you communicate, rather than saying, dear Graham, yours sincerely, in an email. People who are used to communicating by computers are more likely to see slightly unusual behaviors. But as I said, ultimately, it isn't possible to get 100% security. What we're trying to do is reduce the chances of this happening. And technology and training can obviously assist with that.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe got time for one more question just before we go for a break. Do we? Okay, in which case, unless there's anybody, no. If we could possibly get back for